And here we go. I hope everybody's ready for an intellectual adventure, because my book, Empire First, is the red pill of World War II history. And today we're going to chart Winston Churchill's efforts to sabotage D-Day in favour of a strategy which prioritised British oil and empire interests in the Mediterranean over liberating Western Europe from fascism. I'll just say that again. Churchill prioritised British oil and empire interests in the Mediterranean over liberating Western Europe from fascism, and that led him to try and undermine Overlord. I know that's a bit controversial, but we can have a quick chat at the end and you can let me know if you think I'm a fraud or a genius, or maybe a bit of both. So why would Churchill want to sabotage D-Day? Maps explain everything. But please remember that after defending Britain, Churchill's main job was to protect, defend and extend the empire. Most of the empire's valuable territory lay east of Suez. For example, 3/4 of the empire's total population lived in British India, and Malaya produced 40% of the world's rubber and tin in 1914. Also, Britain gets all its oil through Suez in the Mediterranean, and that's fairly important as well. Now, the Suez Canal opened in 1869, just 12 years after the Great Indian Uprising, and slashed sailing time to India by 43%. 15 British bases and colonies scattered throughout the Mediterranean and the Red Sea protected Suez and the fast route to oil in India. And the Mediterranean was an English lake, with the Suez Canal being just like the Thames or the Mersey, leading Anthony Eden to declare in 1945 that controlling the Eastern Mediterranean is a matter of life and death for the British Empire. Life and death, you can't get much more serious than that. Every statesman of Churchill's generation knew that British power rested on controlling Suez and the Mediterranean. That reality was hardwired into their DNA. Then something absolutely dreadful happened in July 1943. The Red Army won the Battle of Kursk, and they'll spend the next 2 years rolling the Nazis all the way back to Berlin. But for Churchill and his colleagues, this transformative Soviet victory was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it guaranteed Allied victory, which on the whole is a good thing. But what if the Red Army rolled into Yugoslavia, Greece or Albania, 3 countries with extended Mediterranean coastlines? What if Stalin starts building air and naval bases in these countries? The idea of Soviet ships and aircraft operating freely in Britain's lake, right next to Suez, was Churchill's nightmare. So I'd argue that from summer 1943 onwards, Churchill was more interested in blocking Stalin in the Balkans than in liberating Western Europe from fascism. And that's why he opposed Overlord. Because if Overlord goes ahead, it'll absorb all the resources Churchill needs to counter Stalin in the Balkans. And Churchill's opposition towards Overlord is evident in multiple official documents. Here's one example from October 1943, and I'll just let you digest that for a wee minute before I carry on. Everything in italics is a direct quote from an official document. So, as the document reveals, Churchill's top 3 priorities are all Mediterranean: Italy, the Balkans, the Aegean. And even though he's twice told the Americans that Overlord will be the defining Allied operation for 1944, he can't even bring himself to mention it by name in this document. And point 5 is just a lot of pious waffle about building up American forces in Britain without clarifying how or when they'll be used. It's just hot air. Funnily enough, documents such as this, which confirm Churchill's hostility towards Overlord, were omitted from his 6-volume account of the war to create an entirely false narrative, which still informs current understanding. Maybe his dog ate his homework that day. Now, if Churchill's going to prioritise the Mediterranean and thwart Overlord, He must overcome two big challenges and exploit two major opportunities. So we'll examine those now, starting with the challenges. Firstly, by 1943, Britain is no longer a true global superpower. It cannot impose its will on its allies, and troop numbers in Europe at the end of the war reflect this impotence. By spring 1945, Stalin had 200 divisions fighting on the Eastern Front. America had 60 divisions fighting in northwestern Europe, while also supporting two major Pacific offensives. But when Churchill met Stalin and Roosevelt in November 1943, he told them that the 16 divisions Britain could commit to Overlord in 1944 would represent its total commitment to the Northwest European theatre. 200, 60, 16. It's not the big three, it's the big 2.5. Also, America favours a cross-channel assault and Britain needs American lend-lease to continue fighting the war. So Churchill cannot afford to alienate his benefactor by openly proposing alternative strategies. And if Britain and America don't deliver a second front in 1944, the alliance with Stalin is dead. He's been calling for a second front since July 1941. And when the operation he thought he'd been promised for summer 1943 didn't arrive, he was absolutely furious and recalled his two cuddly pro-Western ambassadors from Washington and London and replaced them with hardline Kremlin apparatchiks. If Britain and America don't deliver a second front in summer 1944, Stalin may conclude a separate peace with Germany, which would be disastrous for Britain and America. So putting it simply, Churchill cannot openly oppose Overlord for fear of alienating his allies, but he does enjoy two major advantages. So let's examine those first. But here's a key fact. You can only launch an amphibious assault on northwestern Europe between May and September. Outside of the summer months, the wind, the weather, the water, they're all just too choppy, rough and unpredictable to safely launch an amphibious operation, and your operation may be destroyed by adverse weather conditions rather than enemy action. Now, the Allies had expelled Axis forces from Africa in May 1943, but that's just too late in the year to return everything to Britain to cross the Channel in summer 1943. So Overlord has to be postponed till summer 1944, giving Churchill a 9-month window when he can try and bend Allied strategy to his will. In other words, he's got a bit of time at his disposal. Also, by autumn 1943, the Western Allies are fighting in his preferred theatre. They can't cross the Channel till 1944, but they also can't stand idle for a year. So the Allies invade Sicily in July 1943 and mainland Italy in September, but with very different hopes and aspirations. US Army Chief George Marshall worries that the Mediterranean will become a suction pump, draining resources away from Overlord. So he wants limited operations only in southern Italy. But I'd argue that Churchill wants the exact opposite. He wants the Allies to become so embroiled in the Mediterranean that they can't launch Overlord in 1944, enabling him to achieve his goals without offending his allies. Churchill is effectively relying on Mediterranean mission creep to achieve his goals, and I would argue that the two operations he authorised at the end of 1943 and beginning of 1944 were undertaken to lock the Allies into the Mediterranean and block Overlord for 1944. Here's how it works. A significant Mediterranean breakthrough in late 43 or early 44 will pressurise the Americans into releasing resources to exploit that breakthrough, and those resources can only come from Overlord. A massive Mediterranean breakthrough in 43 or early 44 might drain enough resources away from Overlord to make it impossible to launch in summer 1944. And remember, 6th of June 1944 isn't set in stone for Allied commanders as it is for us, because quite simply, they haven't been watching all the documentaries and films about the subject that we have. For Allied planners at the time, everything is fluid, nebulous, and uncertain. So I'd argue that Churchill launched 2 Mediterranean operations during late 43 and early 44 to lock the Allies into the Mediterranean and block Overlord. These operations were not designed to accelerate Germany's defeat. They were inspired by the political goal of defending Britain's empire, rather than the sound military objective of defeating Germany, and as a result, both operations were abject failures. Churchill had to derail Overlord by spring 1944 before its momentum became unstoppable. So he forced through 2 operations characterised by inadequate resources, defective planning, and flawed assumptions about how enemy forces would respond. So I'd further argue that the 50,000 young men who were killed, wounded, or captured in these operations were victims of Churchillian incompetence and imperial obsession. In the ledger of his reputational account, both operations are major stains on his legacy. Now, we don't have time to examine both operations in detail today, but I will say that in autumn 1943, Churchill launched Operation Accolade at the opposite end of Europe from Overlord to try and draw Turkey into the war and open up a Balkan front, which would both inconvenience Germany and block any Soviet advance towards the Mediterranean. To sum everything up, Accolade failed miserably. Turkey remained neutral till February 1945. Hitler enjoyed his final victory of the war, and a dishonest and completely inaccurate reference to Accolade kickstarts the film The Guns of Navarone. So let's now examine Churchill's January 1944 Anzio landing, officially known as Operation Shingle. In my view, Shingle's main goal was to smash German forces in Italy before using Italy as a springboard into Yugoslavia to grab the Adriatic coast before Soviet forces arrived. I say this because Italy's geography permits no other option. If Shingle succeeds, you cannot keep going north because you run into the Alps, and not even Churchill was barmy enough to try and fight his way through the Alps. You could go west into southern France, but when the Americans proposed such a move, Churchill expressed vitriolic opposition, and we'll look at this later. The only other option is to cross the Adriatic into the former Yugoslavia, and British planners devised 2 plans to do just that, Armpit and Gelignite, but neither operation was implemented because Anzio failed and the required resources were deployed elsewhere. So what happened at Anzio? First, let's look at the key locations. By Christmas 1943, the Allies were bogged down on the Gustav Line, a major German defensive position centred on Monte Cassino. Churchill wanted to bypass this barrier by landing at Anzio, which is 80 miles north of Gustav and 40 miles south of Rome, and he played a leading role in devising Shingle as he recovered from illness in Tunisia in December 1943. Shingle was a wholly British concept developed while the American theatre commander Eisenhower was away from his headquarters inspecting troops in Italy. Shingle was supposed to do 2 things. Firstly, by threatening Germany's rear, it would supposedly draw forces away from the Gustav Line, allowing Allied armies to smash through the weakened German positions on Gustav. Secondly, Shingle force was supposed to move inland so that when German 10th Army was evicted from Gustav, it would be crushed in a massive pincer between Shingle force and Allied armies pushing up from the south. The Americans were dubious about Shingle from the outset, believing that the two divisions, which was all Shingle could land in the first assault, would be annihilated if they moved inland. However, a British officer, General Henry Maitland Wilson, replaced Eisenhower as theatre commander in January 1944, and Wilson was basically Churchill's stooge, so Shingle was always going to go ahead. Despite all this, Shingle started brilliantly on the 22nd of January 1944, with 36,000 troops landing safely for minimal losses. However, the Shingle Force commander, General John Lucas, was an extremely cautious man who believed that two divisions would be destroyed if they move inland, and his immediate boss, General Mark Clark, had rewritten Lucas's orders to give him maximum operational flexibility. So instead of moving inland, Lucas spent the first week of Shingle consolidating his beachhead, and this delay allowed Hitler to reinforce Italy with troops drawn from the rest of Europe, so the whole Shingle concept collapsed within a week. Churchill had naively assumed that Germany would withdraw forces from Gustav to isolate Anzio, and when this didn't happen, the stalemate on Gustav continued for another 4 months, while the stalemate at Anzio also persisted. Now, Allied forces finally broke through Gustav and out of the Anzio perimeter in mid-May, so Shingle was now free to fulfill its original goal, and Clark was ordered to send his troops to Valmontone, a small town on Highway 6, to block the retreating Germans. But after a couple of days, he directed most of his force towards Rome, which had been declared an open city. And while American soldiers were guzzling grappa in Rome, German forces escaped north in good order to reinforce a line between Pisa and Rimini, which then held up the Allied advance for another 4 months. The interesting thing is that Clark was never punished for disobeying orders. He was actually promoted later in the year, so why is Clark never punished? We can maybe discuss this in the question and answer session, along with the impact of Churchill's Mediterranean strategy on the development of British rock music. So that's my basic argument. Churchill launched Accolade and Anzio to try and lock the Allies into the Mediterranean, and when both operations failed and Overlord succeeded brilliantly, he started rebranding himself as Overlord's greatest champion, a position not supported by official documents. I'm now going to discuss two further operations which add extra weight to my case, but let's start by reminding ourselves that Churchill's metaphorical nickname for Southern Europe was the Soft Underbelly. Soft Underbelly. He presented Southern Europe as a great place to fight the Axis, and he even drew Stalin a little picture of a crocodile to illustrate his point. But let's just have a look at a map of Europe. As we can see, the whole of Northern Europe is lovely and flat, perfect for mobile offensive warfare, while Southern Europe, with one exception, is completely covered in mountains and is a terrible place to fight the German army. It's the opposite of a soft underbelly. In fact, when the chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, visited Italy in December 1943, he compared the terrain to the northwest frontier of India, i.e. basically Afghanistan, which, as we all know, is extremely rough terrain and not very hospitable for attacking forces. But one part of Southern Europe does contain a real soft underbelly, and here it is, the south of France. Now, as we all know from our holidays in Saint-Tropez, the Riviera beaches are lovely and flat and lead directly to the Rhone River Valley, which is also lovely and flat and runs for 500 miles almost up to the border with Germany itself. And as we can see, the Rhone River and the Saône River merge after Lyon. The Americans wanted to launch Operation Anvil in southern France simultaneously with Overlord to support the landings in Normandy. And because Churchill is a self-proclaimed massive soft underbelly fan, you might expect him to be a big Anvil supporter, but no, he actively opposed Anvil. And here's an example of his opposition. And again, I'll give you a few seconds to digest this before I carry on. So the man who supports operations in Italy, where the terrible terrain has stalled the Allied advance, is now presenting welcoming, hospitable southern France as formidable country and a cul-de-sac. So why the dishonesty? Why is he so disingenuous? It's very simple. If Anvil goes ahead, it'll confirm France as a decisive Allied theatre and Overlord as a decisive Allied operation and absorb all the resources Churchill needs to confront Stalin in the Balkans, proving that the whole soft underbelly concept was deeply dishonest from the outset, designed to draw the Allies into a dead-end theatre which would only benefit Britain's empire. Fortunately, Stalin and Roosevelt saw through the ruse, and Anvil succeeded brilliantly when it launched as Operation Dragoon on the 15th of August 1944, 2 months later than scheduled, thanks to Churchill's opposition and his Anzio fiasco. So I'd argue that his Italian distractions did undermine operations in France, but just not the big one. We'll now quickly turn to the Far East, where we'll discover that Churchill's Japan strategy and his European strategy were effectively monozygotic identical twins. In Europe, the Americans wanted to end the war quickly by driving towards Germany, while Churchill wanted to mess about in the Mediterranean. In the Far East, the Americans wanted to end the war quickly by driving directly towards Japan through their island hopping strategy, and by June 1945 they'd occupied Okinawa, which is only 450 miles from Japan itself. When Churchill finally focused on the Far East in spring 1944, he proposed Operation Culverin, a plan to liberate Singapore and Malaya. But as this map reveals, Singapore is almost 3,000 miles from Nagasaki. So regaining Malaya and Singapore would contribute nothing towards defeating Japan, but it would reunite the empire with some really valuable real estate and restore British prestige in an area where it had been badly dented. Churchill's Japan strategy and his soft underbelly approach in Europe were two sides of the same imperially obsessed coin. And he only abandoned Culverin when the British chiefs, the American chiefs, and President Roosevelt rejected it. And relations between Churchill and the British chiefs became so tense over this issue of Far East strategy that the British chiefs considered resigning en masse on the 21st of March 1944, only 10 weeks before D-Day. Can you imagine the chaos if the British chiefs had all resigned in one go 10 weeks before Overlord as a result of Churchill's imperial obsession? To sum everything up, I argue that Churchill authorised Accolade and Anzio to try and lock the Allies into the Mediterranean and block Overlord for 1944. He opposed operations in southern Europe's only real soft underbelly. His Japan strategy prioritised empire over victory in the Far East. And he also betrayed southeastern Europe to gain control of Greece and keep Russia out of the Mediterranean when he concluded his percentages agreement with Stalin in October 1944. Now, I've not had time to discuss that in any detail today, but if there's a demand, I could do a quick reading on it. So based on all this, I'd argue that Churchill tried to pursue a Brexit military strategy, which prioritised British global oil and empire interests over liberating Western Europe from fascism. And that, for me, is the essence of Brexit, spurning our closest European neighbours to do deals with India, Australia, and until very recently, Rwanda. Had the Americans endorsed Churchill's Mediterranean folly, the Western Allies would have been bogged down in rugged, mountainous southern Europe, while the Red Army raced across northern Europe towards the Channel with Stalin's T-34s replacing Hitler's Panzers at Calais, which would have been a very poor return to the British people after 6 years of blood, sweat and tears. And with the West locked into impoverished southern Europe and the Soviets dominating affluent industrial northern Europe, the early contours of the Cold War would have been very different and much less favourable to Western interests. So I say we all owe a massive debt of gratitude to Franklin Roosevelt, to George Marshall, and even to Joseph Stalin for forcing Churchill to contribute to an operation he never wanted, actively opposed, and tried to undermine. So thank you very much for your time and consideration. And now you can let me know if you think I'm a fraud or a genius. Thank you.
Thank you, Graeme. Thanks for that talk. I've also popped a link to your website in the chat for anyone that wants to find out more about your research or your book. And if anyone has got any questions, you can pop those in the chat and I can read those out for you. Or you're welcome to take yourselves off mute as well. I have a question, Graeme, and we've got a few minutes left for questions anyway. I just wondered, so your book, your analysis on World War II and Churchill's role within it is quite different from other texts that have been written on the subject. And I wondered if you could let us know a little bit about what led you to this interpretation.
Well, I think it's because a lot of books in World War II start in the 1930s with appeasement or Hitler's rise to power. I start in the 1870s with Churchill's birth and the Disraeli buying shares in the Suez Canal in 1875. So I look at 65 years of the British Empire, Churchill's career, British political development, and I would argue that this much longer perspective that I take on events reveals patterns and trends that are concealed from historians who've got a much shorter perspective. If you want to compare it to volcanology, a lot of historians just look at the eruptions, the volcanic eruptions. My book, because it starts 65 years before World War II starts in earnest, my book covers all the tremors and the eruptions as well. So I think my book is much better, much more profound and more analytical than lots of books, which are basically just Mills and Boon with Spitfires.
Amazing. Thank you. And I mean, as it's so different from other texts that have been written, I wondered perhaps what the reception has been amongst historians. Alison in the chat has also asked a similar question as to whether your account has been gaining purchase with historians.
Yeah, I mean, I'm self-publishing, so it's more difficult to get a bit of a response from certain celebrity figures and historians, but I've got 3 or 4 big hitters have all lined up to say very, very positive things about Empire First. If anybody's watched a documentary in World War II, they will have seen Professor Richard Overy. He is one of the leading World War II historians, and he's written a very positive endorsement. Tom Devine has also written a very positive endorsement. He's not a specialist in World War II. He does Irish and Scottish socio-economic history, but he is a closet World War II buff and the leading Scottish historian. So he's written a very positive endorsement and really enjoyed the book. A very eminent World War II historian, Professor Gerhard Weinberg, he's an emeritus professor at the University of North Carolina. He's given me tremendous support. He read, I watched one of his lectures on YouTube and I liked what he was saying. He didn't seem to suffer fools gladly. So I sent him a manuscript of the book, and he's been hugely supportive. And even when he was invited over to Cambridge to be the keynote speaker at a colloquium, he invited me down to Cambridge to meet him. And also the fact he's an eminent World War II historian. He left Germany as a 10-year-old in 1938 as part of Kindertransport. So the fact that he's had first-hand experience of how horrible and vile Nazism is, and he's a direct link to the events is really, I think that's a really powerful endorsement for me. And Professor Willie Maley, who's recently retired from Glasgow University, has been a great supporter, and saw some of the comparisons between the way I analyse World War II and some recent political developments such as Brexit.
Thank you, Graeme. There's a question in the chat from John, which says, did Churchill ever develop or enact a successful military campaign?
Well, I don't want to. Yeah, Britain started to win military victories from El Alamein onwards, but all the planning for that was done by Montgomery. Now, I don't want to be just sound too negative for negative's sake, but I think given that 85% of the German army's battlefield casualties occurred on the Eastern Front, I think that it was the Red Army and their commanders and the American army that made the biggest contribution to defeating Germany. I mean, Churchill blotted his copybook with a ridiculous plan in the First World War about sailing up the Dardanelles to bombard Constantinople and knock Turkey out of the war. Now, at the time, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty. All the senior admirals opposed this plan, but he talked over them and reminded them that military bosses are answerable to civilian chiefs in British politics. So the plan went ahead, and Britain and France lost a number of their battleships. And then when the Gallipoli campaign was launched a few months later, it was a big disaster. And that's basically what caused Churchill to lose his political prominence in the First World War. He was basically sacked and he became Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. He was effectively coordinating operations in Norway in 1940, and things got so bad that he was forced, before he became Prime Minister, he was forced to step down as the chair of the Military Coordinating Committee. So Churchill doesn't have a lot of military successes to his credit. Allied forces do. And I think the big advantage in World War II is, however bad some of the Allied decision makers were, the Axis opposition were even worse. Hitler was a spectacularly bad military commander. He had no subtlety at all. His basic position was do not retreat, do not give up an inch of ground. And that just basically led to German forces being overwhelmed. So no, I can't think off the top of my head any great military success that can be traced to Churchill.
Thank you. I think we've got time maybe just for one more question, because there is one here in the chat. So we'll get to that. David asks, is Churchill not guilty of the very human flaw of self-interest as opposed to the noble notion of altruism?
Oh. Is Churchill guilty of self-interest as opposed to altruism?
That is
Well, I wouldn't rush to call Churchill altruistic. Churchill was, his father was a lord. He was the second son of a major aristocrat. Churchill basically came from the aristocracy, and his role in life was to defend the interests of the aristocracy. I don't think he was a real friend to the working classes. There was a period early in his career, before the First World War, when he did champion some worthwhile reforms. as part of Lloyd George's government, helped him set up early versions of job centres to support people to find work, and also moderating some of the harsh conditions in Britain's prisons. And he did voice opposition support for Rowntree's study of poverty in York. That did have a big effect on him. But as he got older, he, his interest in social reform declined. So I don't think he was particularly altruistic. He was very much motivated. I think, and I don't think he would deny it, I think he loved being active in politics because that activity perhaps helped him keep some of his demons at bay. Because a lot of people would say that he stayed in office for too long. By the early 1950s, he'd suffered a couple of major strokes and his incapacity was hidden from the British people, but he just couldn't give up politics because I think he needed that activity to maintain his mental well-being. So, like all of us, we're all guilty. We all try and blend altruism and self-interest. That's the sweet spot in life. But I wouldn't say he was particularly altruistic. 1940, he did the right thing. But I would say, amongst other things, he wasn't the only person who wanted to defy Nazi Germany in 1940. And I think that that position was the one which everybody should have taken. The fact that so many British aristocrats and members of the establishment, like Lord Halifax, were willing to consider a deal with Hitler just proves how bankrupt and unfit for government our ruling British elite are.
Thank you, Graeme. I think that might be all that we have time for today. If anyone wants to find out more about Graeme's book or his research, the book, which got right here, the
And
website.
can you see the web address on the merch?
The web address, yep. And I've popped it in the chat as well. So you can visit Graeme's website at empirefirst.org. And Graeme, if you are doing any more public talking, any more events around the book, where can people find out about that? Will that go up on your website?
Not so much my website, but I do post it on social media. Mainly, I'm a bit old school. At the moment, I'm just doing Facebook and X. So I always put up posters and flyers for any events I'm doing online a week or so before they're due to happen, so that people can clear their diaries and come and receive my words of slightly cynical wisdom.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. A recording of this talk will be made available in about a week's time, so you can watch it back. And thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Graeme, for imparting your wisdom on us. And I hope you all have a lovely weekend when it comes to it.
All right. Thanks, folks, for coming. I really appreciate it.